концепція кругової оборони міста Сум, яка включає в себе побудову через зону опорні пункти.
Can Ukraine sustain a defensive campaign on 5 different fronts across the front line, which, according to Ukraine's own commander-in-chief, the General Sumy, Russia is seeking to expand by 70 kilometers, 43.5 miles? That is the primary question that the Ukrainian military command must answer this summer. This Russian strategy is now clear as day. They wish to stretch Ukrainian defenses and reserves to a breaking point this summer. The Ukrainian general said in a statement reported by Spanish newspaper El País, and I will quote here, "The enemy is looking for us to use more reserve brigades in the northern part of Kharkiv." Then, more ominously, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry warned that the enemy may also seek to open new fronts in the north, in the Sumy province. So today, gentlemen, I am going to discuss Russia's strategy of attrition and demilitarization, and more importantly, how opening new fronts in Kharkiv and quite possibly in the Sumy region assists in that plan. But let's get into it. El País visited the Sumy regions, which borders Russia, at the beginning of May, and witnessed what they describe as a race against the clock to build new defensive fortifications. It is well known that this year has been, for Ukraine, marked by a widening deficit of artillery ammunition and available troops. Further, depending on the area of the front line that you focus on, Russia has stockpiles of between 6 to 10 times more artillery shells than Ukraine. Another change from 2023 is Russian air dominance, both in the number of drones and in the greater freedom with which its aviation attacks Ukrainian positions. General Sumy views that the main objective of the Russian army remains in the Donetsk Oblast, particularly in capturing the town of Chasiv Yar. But while this is occurring, he admitted that the Russians have made modest advances during the spring to the direction of the town of Pokrovsk, also in Donetsk, in Robotyne on the Zaporizhian front, and in the towns of Vovchansk and Kupiansk, both in the Kharkiv region. This very same sentiment was expressed in Asia Times, who commented on the large Russian operation in the Kharkiv area, which has, and I quote, compelled Ukraine to pull troops deployed elsewhere, including from Chasiv Yar, while the Russians were simultaneously attacking in the Donbass. The Asia Times reporter viewed that if the intention of the Russian strategy was to force Ukraine to move troops northwards, then it looks like a success thus far. It reports on a strong conviction in NATO circles that Kharkiv, the city, is the target of the Russian offensive. But while it is true that a cauldron is being built by the Russians around Kharkiv city, Asia Times viewed that the Russians really want simply to fight Ukrainians more out in the open than inside a big city. Therefore, in their opinion, the Russian strategy is to induce Ukrainians' army to chase after the invading Russian units and inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainian side. If all goes to plan, the Russians intend to either split the Ukrainian army into two or disintegrate it altogether. And thus, in effect, Asia Times agrees with my theory that the idea isn't so much to take territory, but more to destroy Ukraine's ability to resist. And to make matters worse for Ukraine, there are many indicators that Russia is having success in its ongoing demilitarization operations. First is that the commander of Ukraine's Northern Defense, Brigadier General Yuri Halushkin, was fired by President Zelensky on May the 15th for his failure to properly organize the defensives in the Kharkiv area. He was then replaced by Major General Ihor Tansura. However, according to Asia Times, firing Halushkin changed nothing on the battlefield. The second indicator is that Ukrainian defenses has simply not sufficed at all. For the most part, Ukrainian soldiers are simply digging deep trenches because there is little time to build cement bunkers. In any case, Russia is bringing more flamethrowers and artillery to destroy the trenches. Further, Russian troops are reportedly going into trench fortifications and slugging it out with the Ukrainian defenders. While we don't know much about Russian casualties, we know that Ukraine's dead and wounded numbers are climbing.
Быстрее! Быстрее!
The third point is that Ukrainian armor has not been effective at all. One of the lessons of the Ukraine war is that armor is no longer a frontline weapon if it can be destroyed by cheap drones, air-launched mines, and anti-tank weapons. Fourthly, a large number of Ukrainian troops are captured or are surrendering. Now, for the most part, these are hardened fighters and not recent conscripts, so the surrenders are psychologically significant. There are also reports of units unwilling to carry out offensive tasks or who retreat without orders from their commanders. The numbers are so far not too high, but the Russians are doing their best to publicize them. Fifth indicator from Asia Times is that at least 2 colonels in the Palace Protection Force have been arrested and the head of Zelensky's security team has been dismissed. President Zelensky says that they were planning to kill him and other high officials, and he blamed the Russians.
Security apparatus because the 2 colonels who've been arrested linked with this assassination plot are 2 Ukrainian colonels, part of a protection guard that is sworn to protect senior officials. And so fairly shocking that these 2 individuals, according to Ukraine's security service, were turned by the Russian intelligence services.
But in that regard, however, it is doubtful that the Russians would try to knock off Zelensky unless they had another candidate ready to replace him, which, if they do, is far from being obvious. In fact, if one looks at the war, the Russians have not targeted President Zelensky, but 2 weeks ago it is noted that the Russians have put Zelensky on a wanted list for unspecified crimes. The Russian list, however, is not a kill list like Ukraine's list. The final point cited by Asia Times is that Zelensky and his army now know that the West is not going to send troops to save him or Ukraine. Despite all the recent saber-rattling, Washington has said no to NATO troops. NATO has also said no to NATO troops.
There is no chance of Ukraine winning.
My position is that looking at the reality, looking at the figures, looking at the surroundings, looking at the fact that NATO is not ready to send troops, it's obvious that there is no victory for poor Ukrainians on the battlefield.
And now, even French President Macron is saying he didn't really mean it. The Asia Times journalist does not think that the Ukrainian army can stay in the fight, even in the medium term. It writes that there are simply not enough troops, and those troops that are still fighting for the Ukrainian army are tired, and some are clearly dispirited. Russia's immediate goal is likely to discombobulate Ukraine's army, and this plan is already well advanced. Next, the article says, is what transpires in Kiev. So this agreed diversionary strategy, which is behind the Russian offensive in Kharkiv, is also corroborated by a Russian military observer, as reported in a Vietnamese newspaper, who said that Russia's offensive moves in the Kharkiv area are likely what is considered to be an auxiliary attack aimed at diverting the attention of the Ukrainian armed forces from the hotspots of the front lines. But what was noteworthy in this article was the comments of retired Colonel Anatoly Matvichuk, who assessed Ukraine's strategic reserves as being in the vicinity of 100,000 to 150,000 men, but importantly that most of these units were deployed to protect the capital in Kiev. Further, these units are not well equipped, neither are they as modern as the battle brigades on the front lines. It also seems that this explanation also applies to why Kharkiv's fortifications were so absent. Based on this clip from a Ukrainian journalist, most of the money was used to build fortifications not on the front lines, but in West Ukraine, most likely to prevent Ukrainian men from fleeing the border from Ukraine's increasingly draconian conscription efforts.
Сейчас идет российское наступление в Харьковской области. Российские войска заходят в один населенный пункт с другим. В Украине скандал. почему за все время войны не построены фортификационные сооружения и минные поля. А военные кричат, что это целенаправленный саботаж. И у меня два вопроса. Первый. Так, может, Зеленский глубоко законспирированный российский агент? И второе. Знаете, почему нет сооружений? Потому что все средства направлены на укрепление западной границы. Задумайтесь, Украина воюет с Россией, но строит заборы, покупает дроны, увеличивает количество пограничников не на границе с Россией, а за спиной своих граждан, чтобы не убежали.
The Ukraine manpower problem is perhaps more acute than its ammunition problems. The aforementioned colonel noted that while it is possible to strengthen forces quickly, rookie soldiers need to be trained and armed, but Ukraine doesn't have the weapons, and as a result, the losses of these units are huge. Earlier, the head of the General Intelligence Directorate of Ukraine, also known as the GUR, General Budanov, admitted that the armed forces of Ukraine is at its limit and the country's reserve force is gradually running out. So briefly, as to the possibility of this new front this summer to the Sumy region, several media outlets have given the following reports. Reuters reported on the 14th of May that Ukraine's military has warned of a Russian buildup to the north near Sumy region and that a cross-border attack on a new flank in Sumy would likely stretch Kiev's depleted forces even further after the Kharkiv incursion. General Budanov said that Russia had a small group of forces in the border areas near Ukraine's Sumy region in the vicinity of a Russian town called Sudza, and described the current Russian strategy as a test of Ukrainian manpower, which is running short and needs to be replenished. More recently, today it was published in Ukrainska Pravda that Russian troops are concentrating limited, understaffed and disjointed forces on the Sumy front. In particular, it was reported on the 20th of May that Russians, including Chechens, were amassing on the Sumy front, but the limited number of Russian personnel suggests that Russia's goal is merely to draw back and entrench Ukrainian forces near the border. The current estimate is that Russia has between 9,000 to 10,000 troops in Kursk Oblast, consisting of 3 motorized rifle regiment, 8 motorized rifle, tank and infantry battalions, 1 airborne battalion, and at least 2 assault units at the level of a reinforced company. Ukrainian media website Liga also reported earlier today that the Ukrainian State Border Service members warned that the Sumy border with Russia is more than 560 kilometers, and that even with placing the forces available to Ukraine at that border, a powerful defense would be needed because, and I quote, the enemy prevails in both equipment and personnel.
Може в будь-який момент, навіть попри те, що він не має достатніх сил, спробувати зробити щось подібне, як це зараз відбувається по Харківському напрямку. Саме для того, щоб розтягнути лінію фронту, лінію активних бойових дій і, власне, розтягнути сили оборони нашої країни. Знову ж таки, якщо говорити про Сумський напрямок, якщо такі дії ворог вчинить, щоб ми посилювали і цей напрямок, і застосовували туди свої резерви. Поки ми маємо такого сусіда, звісно, що треба бути готовими до розвитку будь-яких ситуацій.
So with these reports, I ask, if the estimate of Russian troops mentioned in Ukrainska Pravda is true, that being of a mere 10,000-man force on the Sumy border, and Ukraine doesn't even have enough reserve troops and equipment to match that force on the Sumy border, it is indicative to me of how bad Ukraine's reserve force currently is, and that the defeat in this summer counteroffensive from Russia is all but certain.